one thing I do like to tell you, which is that I respect you a lot as students, and I consider you as my co-equal, if not my teacher, and I learn every day, and that's why I take teaching so seriously. Given that, whatever humble comments I'll be making, I will seek out your challenges, your questions, and for the faculty especially, I would like to see that you please challenge me, question me, criticize me, so that there will be an example for all of us to see how academia goes, and students should not be left out and excluded from that, because the whole idea of questioning and commenting is this idea that we have to practice partiality, that we have to be partial to our own views, and we should try to defend it as much as possible, because if we don't defend ourselves, who is going to defend us? But at the same time, that partiality to our own, holding on to our own position, should be judged in view of impartiality. If we can impartially hold on to our partiality, that is the standard, that's the test, and that's what I'll try to put into this idea, this discourse on human rights, to show how the two sides of human rights that Anna talked so eloquently, the universalist side and the partial side, the particularist side, how the two sides could be brought together, okay? As Siddhartha mentioned, I was born in the jungles of India. There was nothing there at the time, and I had an elder brother, not my own brother, but my soul brother. His name is Amartya Sen, and he and I grew up playing cricket together. We both grew up in the jungles, and he ended up getting a Nobel Prize too. But since he came to the West, and after that I followed him, his career is going downhill and mine is going up, That's the only difference between the two of us. Otherwise, we're just soul brothers. Anyway, growing up in India, one thing though, anytime I'd be wasting food, my parents would tell me, Deen, please don't waste your food. Think of all the American kids eating junk food, So I grew up not being able to waste anything at all. Then coming to this wasteful consumerist society, the United States, so much excess everywhere, so much consumerism. The point is this: we have to consume to survive, to exist. That's okay. But when we exist to consume, that's consumerism. That's to put it the other way around. And that's when it eats us up. It eats our soul. Not only that, it eats us of our humanity. And it affects the global world. And I'll try to tell you how it does, via this idea of human rights. Okay. Now, this idea of liberalism, where human rights belong, where they are located conceptually and in practice, in the practice of liberalism as you know it, let's try to analyze that too, rather in a critical fashion. There are two broad legs of liberalism. One is human rights, the other one is what you call justice, okay? And two have to be combined together. One cannot stand without the other, okay? I would like to show how. Firstly, liberalism itself as an ideology often is branded as a typical Western product. It started at the time of the Great Enlightenment and all that. And so Enlightenment came on the three footings of humanism, rationalism, and liberalism. And liberalism is the grand product of our modern, pre-modern times in the West. And the West has to spread the ideas of reason, rationality, human rights, and show the light to the rest of the world. That was the idea. That was the basis of Western colonialism of the entire world, the poor countries. So liberalism is tainted by that label, that it's a Western product. It need not be. In fact, if you read some of the writings of Nussbaum, Amartya Sen, and so many others, especially the ones who are writing from the subaltern perspective, from the anti-globalization perspective, and from the below rather than from top, below the globalization, they would like to show that those ideas have been there in all cultures, in all traditions, but they have been somehow not recognized because of the power of the West. It has dominating power. So this idea that liberalism brought reason, and it brought this idea of human progress. These two ideas have been instrumental in the process of colonialism, that we have to somehow bring in reason and light all over the world, and that's how humanity progresses and makes progress. And that not only came up with this colonialism, but also domination, subjugation, and all that. Now, of course, those are the old times, not that old, but still there. And then right now we do have what we call this idea of human rights, okay? It was there early on, more in a naked fashion, in this sort of colonial fashion, that those who are not our co-equals, we have to somehow teach them, And if that means dominating them, that's for their own good, this paternalistic attitude. Now, today, human rights come with the idea that human beings are all equal, but somehow that's not recognized in the non-West, so to speak. I hate to use that term non-West in negative, with that negative connotation. If the West is constantly referred as non-East, how does that look? So we'll always have to put ourselves on the shoes of the other side and see how it comes across, okay? And that's the whole idea of partiality, We have to be proud of who we are. At the same time, we have to be impartially proud, And that's a very critical and test. Okay, now, so this idea of be reasonable, that already has this Western bias in it, and that the rest of the world resent. I, as a young boy, as a child, I saw this cartoon that still resonates in my mind. That cartoon was so telling. It showed this emaciated, poor, humiliated, subjugated man, almost half naked, lying on the ground. And there is this Wall Street type big dude, suited and booted with a big cigar, with his booted one feet on top of the body of that lying man, holding that person down, okay? And is asking that person down, asking him, how can I help you? Please tell me, what is the way I can help you? I'm here to help you. And the man barely can speak because of the weight of the boot on his chest. He can barely speak. He says, well, would you mind taking your feet off my body? And this big man standing over him, hovering over him, he says, no, but be reasonable, So that's sort of the idea of reason, And so it comes with a baggage and with lots of suspicion from the other side, from the rest of the world, which would not buy this Western idea of reason as if it's their invention. For example, when you look back way in the tradition, what do we find when Europe was under the dark ages of dogma, religious warfare, persecution, misogyny, genocide, and all that? We found the liberating light of Buddhism, who was a humanist philosopher, and his philosophy was his religion, did not bring in dogma. That was the philosophy of reason, religion of reason, if I might say so, okay? Given that, we get to say that already so much of that was in the East, and in terms of tolerance, diversity, mutuality, what Buddhism and what some of the other Eastern religions showed us, that is incredible, and that we still can practice today. And yet, we somehow tend to believe that we have to Christianize the rest of the world to make them civilized, make them humans, okay? I'll talk more about it a bit later. Now, so let's talk about human rights, one of the pillars of liberalism. Human rights, and also the idea of justice, that's the other pillar. Both these two concepts are suspect concepts. They are fiercely contested in the entire world. There's no one standard idea of what we take to be human rights, what we take to be human empowerment, and what we take to be justice, a just world, how we can live together in an equitable fashion. Okay, so I'll get to the idea of justice a bit later. That's where equity is a big factor. But human rights, which is the question of empowerment, which is the point of making people equal, that people should have equal human rights, equal rights all over, That's idea of equality. That's the basis of human rights, based on the idea of human dignity, individual dignity, human dignity. Okay, now that is a tall order, but that by itself cannot stand. And I'd like to explain why. These are my just written notes based on some of the things I've been hearing and comments. So I'll be putting some of you online. Just please, explain that a little bit more what you said, because I've been learning a lot from all of you, from our students. Okay. This idea of human rights, it surely the very basic division of human rights could fall into two: negative human rights and positive human rights. Now, negative human rights are all of us, we have that right not to be harmed, not to be interfered with, not to be tortured, not to be killed. These are negative human rights based on not, and not. We believe that these human rights are non-controversial. They're incontroverted. Why? Because, yes, we should not be hurting others. Whether you are right here or somebody is out there 10,000 miles away, okay? It's only when it comes to positive human rights, right, to our entitlement. That's where the problem comes, where to draw the line, because every right holder, every right bearer has a corresponding right, not right giver, but somebody holds a responsibility, all of us collectively, to respond to that right and see that that right is upheld. So it's a collective responsibility. So given that, when it comes to positive rights, the question is, how far does that go? How far are we obligated to promote, enhance folks' rights, everybody's rights in a shared human world? If all human beings are equal and they all have human rights just as we all do, how far could you go with that when it comes to positive human rights? And there is a big debate on that, where it stops, how far can it go? Is it most intense with our own dear and the near ones, and gets to be less and less as we get to the bigger global world? Or should it be cosmopolitan, universal, and equally valid everywhere? If that be the case, equally valid, think of the burden of our obligation. We can't even live our life and do our own things. We have to constantly think of this optimizing strategy of maximum benefits and effects for everybody. That's just practically impossible. So given that, lots of questions, where to draw the line and how does it go, okay? But when it comes to negative human rights, people say that's without question absolute. We cannot harm others, okay? We draw the line right there. No further to go. Is that really that simple? Think about it. I talked about excess, consumerism, okay? Now, what Tim mentioned, so let me bring in some student comments. What Tim Lindgren yesterday, he mentioned in his talk about genocide, ecocide, and of course Deep Prof's excellent comments in response to that, combine the two together. Ecocide, if that's genocide, if that's criminalized, of course for right reason, then what about ecocide? Should that be criminalized too? That comes up with a tall order. Look at it. Our Western consumer lifestyle, that is to a large extent contributing to this ecocide. Our consumption, our thirst for consumption, to warfare, to grabbing up resources, to this idea of profit over people, and our war machine. Our war is fought with the tears and blood of the poor folks, often with minority folks, on false pretense they're sent to war. And who are the beneficiaries of that? Big corporations. Number one right now, when it comes to our war machine, are the pharmaceutical companies. Number two, the oil companies. Number three, the arms merchants and producers, those who do all, on and on. It's a big corporate bonanza and profit, and they benefit at the expense of the poor folks. That's the war machine, That's an example of profit over people, and that's one side of capitalism too. So given that, then it's a big question. The idea of negative human rights, not to harm others, is it that unconditional, that clear, and all that? Not at all, and that's seldom discussed. I'll go way beyond these two divisions of negative and positive rights, because toward the end, my idea is to bring two sides together more in a synthesizing fashion to see if we can go beyond rational choice to what we call social choice, okay? Now, so laws of war. Now that I mentioned war, let's take this idea of laws of war and international law. we know that there is a distinction between preventive war and preemptive war. When it comes to preventive war, something to prevent, something that's foreseeable but not imminent, there the idea is that international law is extremely leery about that. In rare cases, a coalition of nations can go for that, only with the United Nations permission and all that, but not otherwise. Now, preemptive. When you preempt something that's imminent, that's there, about to cause danger to our security and to our very survival, to our very existence, then we say, okay, there we can be unilateral, we can decide to act, we don't need to be, in a collaboration with other countries, we don't need to get Security Council permission and all that. But is that distinction that simple? Again, we rely on these dichotomies all the time, us and the other, and this and that. That really doesn't work. So this preemption and prevention, this simple dichotomy did not be all that simple, because especially in today's war of WMD, in the hands of almost everybody and all that, those who would like to harm us, the question is, where do we draw the line? When is the danger is imminent and when it's foreseeable but may come any time? We don't know when, okay? But nonetheless, based on the slippery distinction between preemption and prevention, powerful Western countries have been taking advantage of the slippery slope and going to preventive war in the name of preemption. And that's a standard trick, but only powerful Western countries can do it. You cannot ask Myanmar and Chad and Nepal to be together to fight a war of human rights, interventionist war against China for what it's doing in Tibet. It doesn't happen that way at all. But the West can decide any time which poor country, powerless country, often branding them as rogue nations, to go after them based on this idea of the slippery distinction between preemption and prevention. And it's so the way it is in international law, laws of warfare, in a way that seems to justify that. Take a look at this. We looked at the UN Charter on the first day. On the UN Charter, Chapter 7, I believe, Chapter 7, there they don't talk about human rights at all, What do they talk about? They talk about the Charter in Chapter 7 talks about international peace and security. If there is a danger there anywhere in the world, then the coalition of nations, with the permission of the Security Council, can get in there to do something in a preventive fashion. Okay, it doesn't have to be preemptive, in a preventive fashion. Okay, they say that, but it has to be only under those conditions. But look, there's no mention of human rights violations. But usually we take it as if there's a gross human rights violation someplace, that could lead to regional instability. Eventually that could spread all over. And because we are the police of the world, we have that global responsibility to bring in law and order, so therefore we can go in. So with that sort of logic, we see this idea of the Bush doctrine, how it couches its doctrine in preemptive fashion, that is imminent danger to our national security, and yet at the same time it's the idea of collective security. That's there in, I think, Article 41 or Article 51 in Chapter 7. There, the idea is that when it comes to individual or collective self-defense, then a nation can go for unilateral action without the authorization of the Security Council. Now, when it comes to collective self-defense, often global power, like a superpower like the United States, which believes that it has its interests everywhere, so any danger to its interest any place in the world is a threat to its national security. The moment it has this global military commitment with that rhetoric, then anything anywhere in the world is a question of preemption, not prevention anymore. Do you see how the trick is made? But it's made possible only because of the power of the Western countries, their ability to do so. And it's done in the name of liberalism, in the name of human rights and justice. So naturally there are lots of problems, with these labels. We have to really need to sort them out to see how they could be applied equitably all over the world, and not just for the sake and the interest and the advantage and the benefits of the rich and the powerful nations in a rather very tilted world, So now, what are some of the other laws of war? Well, one thing, we have the so-called just war doctrine. Just war doctrine, where we believe that war should be fought in a just fashion, and there are quite a few criteria depending on whether you try to put some of them together into one or separate them, maybe 4 or 5, maybe up to 10 or 12. One, of course, that it has to be based on a just cause, and then there should be some proportionality between the damage done and the benefits we tend to get, and we can never target the civilians, non-combatants, it has to be only the combatants, things like that. Now, in the name of just war, we believe in the West that we are the bearers of the burden of just war. We have to abide by just war doctrine, and the other side can do anything they want, and so therefore we are in a disadvantage. It's called asymmetric warfare. That's how it has been labeled. But think about it. Isn't there anything more silly than this term asymmetric warfare when it's used vis-a-vis the other and not us with all our military might and everything? There is an asymmetry of power, of resources. All that is built in already with us, and then for us to use that excuse of asymmetry, that they don't fight just war, but we are constrained by just war, so we have to somehow mitigate some of the conditions of just war to be more flexible and go the way we want, and of course that could go all the way, then that's our prerogative, because we're fighting an asymmetric war where the other side doesn't go by the laws of warfare and rules of justice, But there is such a hypocrisy right there. I put it very briefly. Of course, I have my books and articles on that. Everybody has written on these things too. I could go on, but then I would get sidetracked, okay? Another idea of a war, just war, is how we fight war, that in a war, whether it's fought unjustly or justly, when it comes to the fighting soldiers, there has to be some reciprocal vulnerability of the soldiers, so that both sides should be equally vulnerable. But now that we have been practicing this drone warfare, where we call it a riskless warfare, we are not really in danger of anything, and we're targeting unsuspecting folks who may not be posing any danger at that time. But based on our suspicion, somewhere in the deserts of Nevada, we decide that 10,000, 6,000, 5,000 miles away, somebody could pose a danger, so therefore take them out now, okay? So there is some inherent injustice, because this idea of reciprocal vulnerability doesn't hold in drone warfare. Something else. Also, it's not asymmetric warfare either. The other side the other sides don't have that capacity, that military might and technological power to really engage in similar warfare. So given that, isn't that quite hypocritical to take advantage of this just war doctrine and at the same time do anything we want, where the other side, they're also in that similar position, that they have to fight for their survival, and so they have to resort to whatever they can do, and so they resort to what we call terrorism. Okay, one definition of terrorism is that when the force is directed, intentionally directed to non-combatant civilians, to create terror for a political objective, okay? Based on that, what has been perhaps the most and biggest terrorist attack ever in the world, and who did that? To whom? Any idea? Yes?
The U.S. against Japanese civilians.
The U.S., absolutely right. What's your name? Tell me again.
Jamie.
Jamie's point is absolutely right. Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, okay? Think about it. Deliberately targeting civilian cities to erase them through nuclear warfare. That's the only time it has been used, for what? For political objective, okay? Whatever the objective may be, those are speculative, those are matters of speculation. Now lots of history coming in to show that the Japanese emperor was almost on the verge of surrender, and the American powers in the coalition, they got nervous. Wow, we did not get the chance to use the sun power that we have developed. Only we did not know that Russia was already into it. We have developed to impress the Russians at the forthcoming Potsdam conference for bargaining position, So we had to rush. And also during that entire war, The rest of Japan was devastated, but those two cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were kept spotless and clean, so that when the nuclear bomb would be dropped, that will show the maximum devastation that will impress the other side, what we can do with our sun power, okay? The United States truly got vulnerable when it got into this nuclear technology, because then the danger could come from any part of the world. Now it's coming. Whereas until then, there were two big ponds on two sides, east and the west of the United States, and two friendly borders, north and south. America was so better off. Okay, so the point is this: whenever a new phase is brought in through our technological and other mastery that the rest of the world we think don't have, then we create a problem for ourselves, because the world doesn't stand still there. The rest of the world, they catch up with us. Eventually, we're all in peril. So we must know how to live together. So the whole idea that Garrett Hardin, in the 60s, I'm sure, most of you were not in college in the 60s, you were mostly in high school maybe at the time. In the 60s, that was quite common, Garrett Hardin's, lifeboat ethics. Well, the idea is that so many desperate folks, are drowning, they would like to get onto that lifeboat. Only some of us on this lifeboat, we can take only a few. But if we try to take all of them, then we all drown together, so nobody gains. So therefore, just leave them out, only take a few of them, and guess what? Only those folks, maybe they look like us, maybe they hold our national passport, and swimming and showing that, we are whatever, Americans, whatever, And so that's sort of an idea. Of course, I'm making a caricature of that Garrett Hardin principle, but that's the idea. Okay, that idea is long gone. Now we know that we live in an interdependent world. Time has come from a declaration of independence to a declaration of interdependence. And that's the world we live in now. And there, instead of that model of lifeboat ethics, let's go for what we call, or at least what I call, this is my idea, a spaceship Earth. In this context, spaceship Earth. We're all into it together. If something goes wrong with it, we all perish. So you have to make sure that everybody's together, everybody's right, okay? And often the way we think and all that, that matters a big deal, how we act, how we live, okay? Now, so, of course, the US has a way of getting out of that label of terrorism vis-a-vis Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Why? Because they say, no, in a warfare, where it's a total war or something, it's okay to initiate some drastic measures, all that. That's not terrorism. Terrorism is when non-state actors do something, not when state actors in otherwise a big war, okay? These are just matter of, convenience, because most often so-called non-state actors, they are subjects of victimization, impoverishment, and humiliation. And out of that, conflicts come in, and we don't take note of them in a proactive manner early on. When it gets to be too late, then we think that it's time for intervention. And we have to go beyond this interventionist mindset to what I call this idea of preventive non-intervention. Go for prevention, but in a more proactive fashion, in a non-interventionist way. So instead of preventive intervention, let's go toward preventive non-intervention. That's my idea of how a just war should be fought as just peace. So I go from just peace premise, not from just war premise, that tends to eventually lead to more war, not less, okay? So just one or two, a few words I would like to mention in this context. So poverty, racism, misogyny, discrimination of all forms, LGBT discrimination and all that, those are endemic they are systemic in our so-called human rights culture right here. So it's time that we should first look at us before giving the rest of the world lectures, okay? This gap between the rich and the poor is now the widest in the United States compared to most, in fact, all other developed societies, in the world, and it's getting worse and worse. And what we find is endemic in the national system is also endemic in the international order too. It's getting that way too in a very tilted world, and we're the beneficiaries of that tilt. So we have an awesome responsibility to make sure that it doesn't happen. Somehow it's carved. Okay, this idea of racism, it's also endemic from the beginning. The Native Americans, their genocide Not only, of course, as Tim showed yesterday, it happens where this land grab and ecocide and all that leads to genocide. But look at this idea of killing buffaloes, Over 50 million buffaloes used to roam in the early days in the North American land. Now it's less than what? Maybe 1 million or so. They have been ruthlessly killed, not necessarily for food, not even for fun, but for racist reasons, okay? Because they knew, white folks knew, that Native Americans, they rely on buffaloes. So once that's eradicated, killed and gone, then of course that's one sure way to make sure that they're not there anymore, okay? So I love, one of my all-time heroes happened to be Muhammad Ali, I would like to come up with, cite one of his quotes, okay? What he thought about the Vietnam draft and why he didn't go for it. And he was courageous enough at the very height of his career, took the risk and went to jail for that. I wish everybody else could do that instead of going for the war. And that's an example of an interventionist warfare, like the Iraq War, based on some speculation. There was no imminent threat anywhere, but the idea based on the domino theory. Well, if we don't contend them there, 20 years down the road, we'll have to fight them on the San Francisco shore, So therefore go to Vietnam, make sure that it doesn't become a communist country. Now Vietnam is a communist country today. Are we fighting them over on the San Francisco shore? So speculative wars could go horribly wrong, but the damage that's done in the process, that is long-lasting. Even today, the United States is paying for the costs and the damage of the Vietnam War in so many ways. I cannot even begin to list them here. So it was Muhammad Ali who first described the Vietnam era draft as, and he was so right in pointing out the endemic racism of our national policies and including our war policies and all that. He described the Vietnam era draft as white people sending black people to fight against yellow people to protect the country they stole from the red people, So it's all racism through and through, and he saw it so right, for which he rose up and took the burden of that, and he was brave enough to do that, okay? Yesterday, Sola gave such an eloquent talk on this school-to-prison pipeline, okay? Even today, not only even today, especially today it's happening. We have a very racist and brutal justice system, very brutal prison system, police force, and militarization of almost everything now, not only our foreign policy, but our domestic policies too. And on that, and the victims are, of course, the ones who are marginalized, impoverished, poor, and often racial minorities, okay? Same thing we find with misogyny too, Culture is, or human rights culture, in which we take pride to live, is based on misogyny, women's subjugation, their victimization. Of course, it would be wrong, as Anat mentioned it so eloquently, to call women as victims. They are not, and that's the whole idea of women's liberation. They are not victims. They would not like to subscribe to that idea. But let's call this disempowerment, let's call this disenfranchisement, all that way, how women have been portrayed and treated. Let's go way back, okay? Beginning of Christianity, Adam and Eve myth, okay? Look at that. That's the most misogynistic myth you can think of. Eve has been portrayed as a roadside distraction, so to speak, So men have to, in their mission, whatever that is, for something noble and all that, they have to make sure that women are subjugated, controlled, and all that, to make sure that they make their progress. Okay, so women have been characterized as their bodies, and men had been portrayed as their minds. So this rational man and sensual woman, that's the dichotomy that has been there in our culture from day one, and even today, and especially today, in spite of all our progress, we have not been able to get beyond that, thing. Women always as being shown as submissive to men, and they're as objects, sex objects, bodies, that, and men are reason rational beings. So we have to go beyond that too. It's there. The other day, a long distance driving some state, on the billboard, on the side, there was a sign, advertisement of Corvette. Okay, Corvette. This very macho man, flashy clothes, driving a Corvette, and this very submissive woman on his shoulder like that. Do you know the underneath the title of that advertisement? He said, "When you are going for the vet, don't forget to take your dog with you." That type of things, okay. And it's there. Not that long ago, I saw it. It's all around, racism, misogyny, and of course, discrimination in all forms. Speaking about Corvette, it reminds me, what's the difference between a Corvette and porcupines? Corvettes and porcupines. With porcupines, the pricks are on the outside. So that's the only difference. I cannot think of anything else. Anyway, so now I'm talking in bits and pieces about human rights, okay? Talking in bits and pieces about human rights. Now, let me talk a bit about justice.
And then, Deen, do you want to leave time for a
right, definitely, yeah, right. Justice. And when it comes to justice, the question is of equity, okay? Equity. Without equity, justice is, human rights is nowhere, because human rights is for equality of rights. But there are competing equalities, we know that, on so many forms. The question is, how could we have that fairness in the process that can allocate rights in the right way for people based on their actual needs and vulnerabilities, their situation where they are. That's where social choice comes in. Rational choice cannot take us there, okay? So this idea of equity, okay? Fairness in the process. So for that, I would like to put Nakia over there on the stand. She's the one, for the first time I can think of in this seminar, who mentioned of equity, that human rights, that's not enough without equity, and she made a strong case for equity. Then I have been talking with her, and I would like to ask her to share this idea of this picture that says a million words by itself, that little thing, and what you think. Can you just tell us a bit about that? Why human rights by itself is not enough, is equity, along with human rights, these are the two ways we have to go forward.
The picture that he's talking about, and maybe this would paint a great picture for everyone. So if you could just imagine a father standing with his two children looking over a fence to watch a baseball game. And the children are different heights. The father can see over the gate, over the fence, and the two children cannot. So he gives the children each a crate. Same size, same dimensions. The children stand on the crate so they can see over the fence with the dad. One child can see over the crate, the other child is too short, right? So equality in the human rights system is a bit false when we think of it as giving everybody the same thing. Let me give you the same funding for your school. Let me give you the same resources at a particular camp, or let's help in post-conflict with the same thing. That is not always what it takes to bring someone to the position where they can operate on the same level equally as someone else. So that's where equity comes in, where you give a people the things that they need to be independent and not have to be codependent on another nation or entity in order to reach their ideal societal goals or whatever may have you. So, I mean, that's the notion of equity versus equality to me in the human rights scheme.
Wonderfully put, it couldn't have been put any better. Could you just also let them know about that picture, that little one?
Okay. If I can
You can describe that. You can describe, tell them.
did I just describe the picture?
Okay.
Yeah.
So those who have not seen it, just tell them briefly, just what that is. That shows.
There was 3 people, a dad and 2 children, and they were looking over the fence, and it showed the 2 children standing on a box, and one child couldn't see, but the dad and the father could. So equality versus equity. So the child needed maybe 2 boxes, and then he would be on the same platform as everyone else.
Yeah. So two.
Greg has the picture, we can pass it around.
It's a
if you
famous
wanna see it.
picture, we can
Right.
pass it around.
Fine. We can pass it around maybe after this session. Okay, not now. Okay, so these two children, they got the same box in terms of their equal rights. Did that help them in an equitable fashion? Of course not. That's the whole idea of the picture, because one was shorter than the other. So one could not see over the fence. Okay, so that's where equity matters. That's where you have to be more situational, based on people's actual need and all that. So therefore, that brings us to this point. What's the standard Western idea of justice, especially in a liberal society? The whole idea of a liberal society and justice is what we call social justice, based on the social contract theory. I don't want to go into its history or the philosophers behind it and all that. But there, this idea is of equality, symmetry, and that idea of justice is contractual and it's transactional, In recent days, of course, somebody famous came up with this idea of rational choice into this justice process, John Rawls, I might even mention that name, that hypothetical situation where independent, free, equal, usually men, they get together to decide what could be the best outcome for everybody in an imaginary situation, okay? But how could they really think of that imaginary situation when they're all supposed to be presumed to be all equal and independent and free together in a contractual mode, So that is, of course, a thought experiment. So from there, we have to go to this idea that in our world, in our global interdependent world, there is asymmetry. And obligation is there, not because of symmetry of contractual agreement, but precisely because of asymmetry. We have a greater obligation. Why? Because they are vulnerable, we are powerful. That creates some obligation that should be taken note of. Okay, so asymmetry, interdependence, and vulnerability. These are the situation in the real world. So let's not go from top down, okay, in terms of some thought experiment, in an ideal world, in terms of the idea of a perfect justice. Let's go bottom up in terms of collaborative justice that's relational, interdependent, and that's based on the idea of human rights, where we are talking about shared humanity, So go that way. What do we find there? We find lots of diffusion of dichotomies, I cannot be too technical here. I don't want to. That's going to take us a lot of time. But just one point. In our standard discussion about practical reasoning when it comes to justice, we talk about deontic considerations and utilitarian optimizing principle. There are these two dichotomies, but it could be in this social choice as opposed to rational choice policy, we find a method where we can find a broad-based, consequentialist approach that's agent-sensitive, where people's need and the agent's own role is factored into the actual consequence, so that it's not backward-looking, and at the same time, it is receptive to where the agent stands and still looks forward, okay? I don't want to get into that too much, but just try to make a few points about this idea of social choice as I conclude.
We have about 15 minutes.
Right, so maybe 5 more minutes, okay? Well, a few things I'd like to mention, okay? This idea of situated evaluation. We cannot just stand outside, think that everything is just perfect, hunky-dory, and from a perfect idea of justice, we have to take note of the actual situation. So situated evaluation of our own position in the scheme of things, in the broad scheme of things, okay? And it has to be agent-sensitive, consequentialist perspective that endorses the importance of agency, human agency, our own action, our own role in this world, and personal responsibility. And they are so ingrained in our deontic framework that has to be brought into the consequentialist framework. So instead of the social contract tradition of the so-called liberals, we are getting into the other set of liberals which are often neglected in the Western world, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Condorcet, those people, from that tradition. That's mostly consequentialist tradition. Okay, and it doesn't have to be unlimited optimizing principle. It's sensitized by agents' capabilities, okay? Now, so it is a procedure of what we call plural grounding, where we have different modes of pluralistic justice, not just one singular perfect justice, where we try to ground it, our agent's perspective, along with the optimal broad scheme of consequences together. It's called plural grounding and not just one-dimensional grounding. It's also where we talk about valuational plurality based on the idea that there could be more than just one reasonable side. In the West, again, we are so focused in one-dimensional way of thinking that it has to be perfect one way, one reasonable side. And this sort of idea, this new idea, social choice talks about valuational plurality, where we have plurality of reasonable choices, of competing claims. That means perhaps no side wins really outright, but it leads to what we call public debate, public discussion, and that is the very basis of democracy. And we have to see that the rest of the world gets a taste of that, a part of that, so that they are not subjugated, they are brought into the system, and only the powerful countries can make that available to the poor countries and powerless countries. Why? Because it's the powerful countries, they actually dominate and dictate international law. Think about the property law that comes from John Locke, okay, what it did to Native Americans. When the white settlers came in, they realized, wow, Native Americans did not make a claim to their land, because they believed in share land. So the white folks made claims and built something there that became their property, okay? Based on that, they disenfranchised the Native Americans. So all these ways international law is built on racism and discrimination. And that's what it happens. We have to go beyond that. That's the idea. Now, one or two quick points. This idea of public reasoning is very important in democracy, in a thriving democracy. And one reason we got into the Iraq war, for example, that's again a case of preventive war. Iraq was not an imminent threat, we all know that. It's because public reasoning was not allowed. There was this rah-rah of nationalism, and that was, in fact, the problem. So, we are talking about plurality of impartial reasons. If that be the case, again, let's go back to my idea of impartial partiality. There could be plurality of impartial reasons. That means we have to know how to defend our positions in the grand scheme of things where there could be other reasonable options as well. We have to all do a balancing act. That's where social choice comes in. Okay, the last point is human rights are based on our shared humanity. Human beings are all equal everywhere, but without the idea of shared humanity, it's an empty word to say that we're all equal. And that's where we get into that empty rhetoric of universal human rights declarations, okay? And at the same time, we cannot get into what we could call relativism either, or particularism. Then we're all into our own little zones of human rights, and we cannot have a global world in that case, okay, where we all understand each other. So it has to be based on our mutual needs, understanding, and capabilities. If that be the case, then we have to say that human rights are not diluted to make it minimalist, but not maximalized to make it totally non-negotiable and solid and dense, only for our own sake. So the real challenge for human rights is how to make human rights both substantive and negotiable, so that we can operate with those two principles. So right here you see how the two sides in all these ways, when it comes to social choice, brought in together in a fusion, so dichotomies are diffused. And that's the task of liberalism. Liberalism has a built-in dichotomy. It talks big, but doesn't take note of actual situation and predicament of the real folks in the real world. For such a long time, liberals were not that responsive, to the outside world. Even it was mostly the rich white folks. They were concerned about their rights. Minority rights were totally ignored and all that. So therefore, what do we get? From this idea of independence, we get to this idea of shared humanity in an interdependent shared world. So what should be the operative principle here? It should be the principle of solidarity. That's our next big challenge, not based on the old idea of liberal sympathy. Wow, we feel bad, but what can we do? So let's just do our own thing, and consume, So no, it has to be based on what? Empathy, not sympathy. And for that, again, somebody else in this class, Melissa right here, she brought that idea in for the first time. I was struck by that. So there was the idea of equity. Nakia brought that in there. Idea of empathy, Melissa brought in. Can we talk a bit about the role of empathy in solidarity? Let's have discussion along that line for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever.
Well, the thing that I just brought up was Jeremy Rifkin's philosophy. And do you want to kind of go, I could just post that video on Facebook. It's like a 10-minute thing. I'll post it and I'll send it to you, Dean. And anybody can watch it and then maybe we can talk about it after everybody's seen it.
Yeah, because Dean, we only have about
Yeah.
5 minutes, 6
Oh.
minutes. So let's review our question.
Then my last point, then this. I should have gone a different way, though, maybe. Okay. Thing is that conflicts and tensions in this world, on the domestic front and on international front, they are all due to deprivation, humiliation, and all that. To take care of deprivation is what we call proactive, just development. Development, yes, but not in this sort of a fashion where profit over people, but proactive, just development, sustainable development. And for humiliation, the answer is inclusion, So both on the international scene and also on the domestic front, okay? So these are the way to go. This is what I call preventive non-intervention. So therefore, there is a paradox I would like to resolve in one line, which is this. There is a seeming paradox, but it's not really a paradox, it's seeming. I would like to say that this holocaust of neglect, to use a term that was used by Oxford Professor Henry Shue, a friend of Cheney's and mine, at Oxford, holocaust of neglect that we find in the Western world toward the needs and vulnerabilities of the poor folks in the rest of the world, this holocaust of neglect, because of that, eventually we get into preventive war. When it's too late, we have not noticed it, didn't take care of it, couldn't even care less. Now we find that, wow, it's on our doorstep. Why? Because we realize that we cannot have an affluent community, an affluent country in an affluent island in a sea of poverty, okay? So, but if we instead were engaged, proactive engagement, that would have taken us out of intervention. Isn't that paradoxical? But not really, understand it. Our holocaust of neglect and inaction leads to intervention. Our proactive engagement leads to non-intervention. Keep that in mind. That's how it goes. So I'm combining both justice and human rights together vis-a-vis international law, laws of war, and all that. Okay? So I try to put in quite a few things. We can talk.